Welcome to this lecture series titled Our Living National Constitution, Its History and Evolving Interpretation. I'm Edward J. Dodson. This is Lecture 1, titled Lessons from Past Civilizations. What follows in this first lecture is the history of our efforts to create societies that succeeded, at least for a time, and explore the reasons why most eventually collapse. The remainder of the course will examine the experience so far in the United States of America. Important guides in this story include the 2017 book, The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution, written by Ganesh Sitaraman, a professor of law at Vanderbilt University and director of the program in law and government. Also relied on for this history are three books written by Frederick Lewis Allen: Only Yesterday, An Informal History of the 1920s, published in 1931. Since Yesterday, the 1930s in America, published in 1939. And The Big Change, America Transforms Itself, 1900 to 1950, published in 1952. Allen earned a master's degree at Harvard University in 1913, and a few years later became managing editor of the Century magazine. Then, in 1923, he joined Harper's, eventually appointed editor-in-chief in 1941. Of course, there are many additional valuable sources of insight into the making of the Constitution of the United States and the meaning and intent of its articles and amendments. One of particular importance is the book We Hold These Truths by philosopher Mortimer J. Adler, published in 1987. A recommended reading for important insights into the origins of the ideas guiding the framers of the U.S. Constitution is the book First Principles: What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country, written by Thomas E. Ricks. Also, the historian Charles A. Beard wrote a number of works on the Constitution, controversial because of its conclusions regarding the motivation of the framers to secure and protect their own interests. Written in the form of fictitious conversation, Beard's 1943 book The Public is also of unique importance. And finally, if not exhaustively, there is the detailed analysis by historian Lance Banning of James Madison's evolving views on republics and on governance, The Sacred Fire of Liberty, published in 1995. I would be remiss if I did not also tell you that this series of lectures draws upon the analysis of societal organization contained in the writings of the American political economist Henry George, and some of those who came to embrace George's explanation of how the world actually works. So with that, we begin with some of the important observations made by Professor Ganesh Sitaraman. In the first chapter of his book, he traces the history of republics and their constitutions, quoting from those considered to have contributed most importantly to questions of why all civilizations eventually collapse. His answer comes on the first page of the introduction. He writes, "From the ancient Greeks onward, political philosophers were preoccupied with the problem of economic inequality and its relationship to the structure of government. The wealthy elites would clash with everyone else, the rich oppressing the poor seeking to confiscate and redistribute the wealth of the rich. Economic inequality led inevitably to political inequality and, as a result, instability, class warfare, and constitutional revolution." An important lesson for the framers of the U.S. Constitution came, he writes, from the history of the fall of the Roman Republic. As the rich got richer, they purchased more and more land, and land speculation became a common practice, particularly in regard to public lands. The number of dispossessed former smallholders grew, as did the degree of economic inequality. In his most extensively read and studied book, Progress and Poverty, an inquiry into the cause of industrial depressions and of increase of want with increase of wealth, published in 1879, Henry George found a direct link between the privatization of land ownership and the stresses that eventually led to the collapse of both Greece, Rome, and nearly all other ancient empires. Henry George wrote, "Wherever we can trace the early history of society, whether in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, in America, or in Polynesia, land has been considered as common property, in which the rights of all who had admitted rights were equal. That is to say, that all members of the community, all citizens, had equal rights to the use and enjoyment of the land of the community. The causes which have operated to supplant this original idea of the equal right to the use of land by the idea of exclusive and unequal rights may, I think, be everywhere vaguely but certainly traced. They are everywhere the same which have led to the denial of equal personal rights and to the establishment of privileged classes. These causes may be summarized as the concentration of power in the hands of chieftains and the military class, consequent on a state of warfare, which enabled them to monopolize common lands, the effective conquest in reducing the conquered to a state of land slavery and dividing their land among the conquerors and in disproportionate share to the chiefs. The differentiation and influence of a sacerdotal class and the differentiation and influence of a class of professional lawyers whose interests were served by the substitution of exclusive in place of common property and land, inequality, once produced, always tending to greater inequality by the law of attraction. A note, the word sacerdotal is a doctrine which ascribes sacrificial functions and spiritual or supernatural powers to ordained priests. How this concentrated control over what nature provided to us all essentially free of charge, subject only to our willingness to apply our labor to the land, really affected justice in societies. And this was examined by Professor of Sociology Gerhard Lenski in his 1966 book, Power and Privilege, A Theory of Social Stratification. Lenski writes, "In agrarian societies, land grants nearly always carried with them definite political responsibilities. In addition, those given landed estates were usually expected to provide the basic elements of civil government, notably the maintenance of law and order and the collection of taxes on their properties." Well, problems always existed, however. The ideal of just law, justly enforced, was rarely approached and never sustained over time. As Professor Lenski adds, a favorite source of income in virtually every agrarian society was the sale of justice. Apparently, almost every official involved in the judicial process was demanding a fee or gratuity. Not only was justice for sale, but so were other powers of government vested in the hands of officials. Government officials often refused to act unless the parties concerned were willing to make it personally advantageous to them to act. The historian Emanuel Wallerstein described the morphing of the first settled society organized to promote agrarian landlordism into the system we describe by the term capitalism. But first, a clarification. If by capitalism one means a system under which an overwhelming majority of individuals earn a significant portion of their income by the ownership of actual capital goods, capitalism remains a distant and increasingly impossible societal objective. More accurately, agrarian landlordism evolved into a more complex system of agrarian, commercial, financial, and industrial landlordism. Professor Wallerstein provides some of the dynamics at work. One of the basic phenomena of modern capitalism is the slow but steady growth of the largest state, a process of increasing concentration. A principal method was the enclosure of commons, which seems not to have abated significantly during the last half of the 17th century. It took money and effort to create such estates in difficult times. Increasingly, land was transferred by sale into non-noble hands. These large estates were in part put together piecemeal and therefore some of the concentration of ownership was just bookkeeping centralization. By definition, such bookkeeping centralization entailed consequently increased absenteeism. How this came to affect relations in the newly formed United States of America is suggested in a letter written by George Washington to his brother-in-law early in 1776, when the prospects of success in the war for independence were anything but encouraging. Washington writes, "Thank you heartily for the attention you have kindly paid to my landed affairs on the Ohio, my interest of which I shall be more careful of, as in the worst event, they will serve for an asylum." Fast forward to the last quarter of the 18th century, and Professor Sitaraman describes the new Constitution of the United States of America as becoming the law of the land under circumstances that ostensibly offered the majority a real opportunity to acquire property in land, what was for most people seen as their only real opportunity for self-sufficiency. He writes, "Our Constitution isn't based on the assumption that class conflict is inevitable. Our Constitution is a middle-class Constitution. Unlike the class warfare constitutions of earlier times, our Constitution assumes relative economic equality in society. It assumes that the middle class is and will remain dominant. In short, it assumes that the availability of free or very cheap land offered out of the public domain would last for centuries." One measure of where we have been heading is household income. The percentage of Americans classified as middle class fell from 61% in 1971 to 51% in 2023, according to the Pew Research Center. The other measure most often pointed to is the rate of home ownership, that is, the ownership of a residential property consisting of a housing unit and the underlying parcel of land. Also, one might own a share of the land parcel if one's housing unit is in a multi-story condominium or cooperatively owned building. Note that the percentage of home ownership today remains below the 2005 peak. Property prices, and land prices in particular, have been increasing every year since the bottom of the 2008 property crash. One reason why residential properties are out of range for many households is the double-digit annual increases in land prices in most of the metropolitan markets across the United States, as revealed in this chart. Back at the creation of the new nation, the most important reason why the framers of the U.S. Constitution were confident that a high degree of economic equality would remain as time went on had everything to do with the vastness of the continent in comparison with the population into the foreseeable future. Professor Sitaraman tells us, "Because the new American nation had readily available land to the West, there would be economic opportunity for anyone to own property and build an economic future." At least that was the assumption. And of course, what was meant by anyone was white males. As Benjamin Franklin surveyed the emerging American system, even he could not bring himself to see a time in the future when the vast North American frontier might close. It was inconceivable to him that the vast continent might become absorbed by private owners of vast holdings whose incomes came from leasing land to others and from speculation rather than the production of tangible wealth with which to engage in commerce. He wrote, "Land being thus plenty in America, and so cheap as that a laboring man that understands husbandry can in a short time save money enough to purchase a piece of new land sufficient for a plantation, whereupon he may subsist a family. Labor will never be cheap here. No man continues long a journeyman to a trade, but goes among those new settlers and sets up for himself." For just how long this might remain the case, Franklin left to the future. Thomas Ricks reminds us just how quickly Franklin's world was disappearing. James Watt's steam engine was devised in Glasgow in 1781. In the course of a few decades in the 19th century, human and animal muscle were outstripped by this new power. Placing the power of steam in boats had a liberating effect on the states between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, dramatically cutting the time and money it cost to move grain, cotton, and other farm products to market. It also reduced the prices of the cloth, clocks, plows, and other manufactured goods those riverboats carried up the Ohio, Tennessee, Cumberland, Wabash, Monongahela, and Yazoo rivers. And of course, all this progress enriched those who had already managed to gain control over land. Wealthy investors formed land companies and used their political influence to their financial benefit. John Adams, destined to become the first vice president and the second president of the United States, was convinced of the need to prevent the type of imbalance that characterized almost all other nations. He believed correctly that preserving relative equality over time would require government intervention in the distribution of the public domain to the nation's citizens. The only possible way of preserving the balance of power on the side of equal liberty and public virtue is to make the acquisition of land easy to every member of society, to make a division of land into small quantities so that the multitude may be possessed of landed estates. However, it would be during the presidency of his son, John Quincy Adams, that the process of selling off the public domain would escalate as the means of raising revenue needed for constructing roads, removing obstructions in rivers, and building canals. Thomas Jefferson, a controversial figure when judged by modern standards of moral behavior, was another of the founding leaders who believed in the leveling influence of landed property if made universally available by the nation's government. Jefferson's position is summarized by Professor Sitterman. Jefferson believed the unemployed should be free to take up uncultivated land, and he proposed that every man who didn't have 50 acres of property be given property so he met that minimum threshold. To be sure, except for the most enlightened of these men, and all involved were men, the ideal of equality of opportunity applied only to white men, and there was considerable debate over whether participation in governance should be limited to those white men with at least a minimum level of property and perhaps formal education. The leaders of the founding generation, most of whom were formally educated in the ancient writings of the Romans and Greeks, might have recalled what their English contemporary Edward Wortley Montagu had written in his Reflections on the Rise and Fall of the Ancient Republics. Montagu understood human nature and the risks this posed to a republic. The larger cause was love of luxury, which leads to corruption and thus to competing parties. Would the young republic survive? Would its constitutional government secure and protect life, liberty, and property as hoped? Or would strong differences in values, in societal and cultural norms, and in belief systems cause the Republican experiment to implode? We will pick up the story in Lecture 2. We've reached the end of Lecture 1.